Welcome to Empire State Engagements. I'm Dr. Robert Childs. When most people think about Gilded Age New York politics, they think about unscrupulous politicos plundering the public, and names like Boss Tweed or Roscoe Conkling come to mind. I spoke with Dr. Jeffrey Broxmeyer about his revisionist take on this era entitled Electoral Capitalism. He shows that even some of these familiar names deserve a fresh look because not only were they political bosses, they were also entrepreneurs.
Tweed sees himself as a businessman, and you could, and one of the things that I was surprised and found so fascinating about Tweed as a figure is the thing that he's doing most is, founding businesses or spreading out his investment. He has an empire, an absolute empire that's never mentioned in a century of historiography.
Welcome to Empire State Engagements. My guest today is Dr. Jeffrey D. Broxmeyer. Dr. Broxmeyer is Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Toledo. His articles have appeared in journals including the wonderful New York History Journal and the Journal of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, of whose editorial board he has recently become a member. And in 2020, Dr. Broxmeyer's first monograph was published by the University of Pennsylvania Press, Electoral Capitalism, the Party System in New York's Gilded Age. We're here to talk about that fine monograph today. It is a fresh political history of late 19th century New York State. It's an important interdisciplinary revisionist contribution to the study of Gilded Age politics, and I am enthusiastic to discuss it with you today. So welcome, Jeff, to our show.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for coming. And the title, right off the bat, the title of your work, Electoral Capitalism, I think it catches the eye because when we think of the Gilded Age, we think of bosses who are avariciously seeking to enrich themselves using politics, warping politics. But that's not really what you mean here. You introduce electoral capitalism as a sort of new framework for understanding a lot of what goes on in this period in a more nuanced way. You call it a category of entrepreneurship in which the capture of public office and the accumulation of private wealth are mutually reinforcing endeavors. So first of all, tell us a bit about what you mean by this concept, electoral capitalism.
Sure, thanks. A good place to start is maybe the way in which in the 19th century, right, we have, I would argue, a fusion of office holding with property in a way that's important to understand. And that changes over time, the way in which that interacts. But in the Gilded Age, And in particular in New York, the argument is that there's this party system that emerges around this kind of common experience of the accumulation of wealth through political parties and via office holders, and the way in which that's distributed through political organizations and involved in the winning of elections and the capture of public office, and then the using of that office in order to keep the kind of machine going and build some really significant fortunes for individual party leaders, but then also use those resources as a way to maintain your kind of electoral competition, and in many ways try and build and maintain large coalitions that are important for governing at various levels. And so the thing that I found in this period that seems to be systemic in the sense that the people who are most influential in this period and the kind of main party regulars who are the ones who really dominate the political system, they find a way to kind of gain control over these things of political value, like, for instance, nominations for offices or political appointments once you win office, and you have all of these appointments that you can make depending on which office you've kind of conquered. All of these rights and privileges that political institutions can distribute. So subsidies, charters, franchises, all of these kinds of things. And those things of value are put together in these really creative ways by office seekers who are in politics for all the reasons that we normally think of people are in politics for, right? But part of that is also as a mechanism of upward social mobility, right? And that's individual in the sense that you have these really ambitious party leaders who kind of build these factions around themselves, right? But it's also really tied up to the way in which constituencies are served through governing in the way that we normally think of it, right? The institutions change in different moments, both in terms of the public offices, but also the political party organizations. And the electoral capitalism idea that kind of comes out of looking at this historical period is that you could see that political institutions are really part of this moment where capital accumulation becomes pretty important for understanding how political behavior works, right? The Gilded Age is a moment of industrialization, especially in New York, high finance, right? And that finds expression in the political system too, in ways that are really important to understand how things work. So we normally think of capitalism as, say, workers who are employed in, say, businesses, right? And you know, there are markets with various kinds of commodities, like you're selling, I don't know, whatever, like iron or something like that, right? But in electoral capitalism, I try to make the argument in the book that the main actors who are doing the kind of the normal practices that we would associate, right, with the kind of capitalism, it's really office holders, right? Office holders are the ones who are accumulating and investing to a large degree, and they're extremely creative about how they go through and try and put together their opportunities, right, if you could think of it in that kind of way. So electoral capitalism as a concept tries to think about how governing institutions in this historical period, but you I think can, say, use this concept if you're kind of historically minded about it. You can think about the way in which you could see some parallels, right, in other kinds of periods too, or maybe other situations. But governing institutions, they really do serve as a source of capital. So there are a few ways in which that's true in this book that I kind of work through. One is when office holders get access to taxpayer money, right? And they can do things with that. And they're very creative with what they do, right? And there's also debt financing, right? So that's pretty important for the Tammany Hall faction that ends up creating an entire financial sector that's really pretty closely aligned with local politics. But then the stalwart Republicans at the national level really do that as well in their connection to national debt that's grown so much through the Civil War and trying to repay that. And so debt financing is also a really important way that these office holders that are really looking for ways to kind of make some money together, build their large coalitions, finance their election mobilization. And then the third piece of this that is really important for thinking about electoral capitalism and how it functions is that office holders are really at that sweet spot in political institutions where they control, or even in some cases create, new markets, right? So they control the conditions of entry into markets in some cases, but in other cases they're just altogether creating these new, really potentially lucrative markets. Like you could think of in this period, in the Gilded Age period, the importance of railroads, for instance, right? Railroads, express companies, telegraph companies, land markets, especially, right? In New York, land super important, and that's a politically mediated process. So the electoral capitalism concept is trying to think about the way in which property, which is always somewhat changing forms of it, right? It's always somewhat in flux. What you can do with it is always somewhat, from historical moment to moment, in evolution and transformation. But this is the Gilded Age is a really wild moment where you have a bureaucratization of capital, of business, right? The rise of the kind of modern companies that are beginning to have national scope, right? But then also you have the end of some forms of property, like in human people, right? So with the 13th Amendment and the centrality of the Republican coalition at the national level in the Reconstruction amendments. And so this is the moment when property is kind of in flux, and in New York, a whole bunch of political figures end up just accumulating a lot of it, and actually pretty quickly. And that ends up being a bit of a surprise to a lot of the public, which is kind of trying to figure out what's going on. They're trying to figure out how they feel about it. Is this something that's okay? Is it kind of normal party politics? Or is this something that's really quite evil and insidious and the cause of all of our travails and that kind of thing? So that was the way in which I was trying to think about the Gilded Age and politics and inequality in a way that's a little bit distinctive from the kind of typical thinking about politicians as kind of thieves or something like that, right? Or politicians as filled with bad people, right? People who are, the kind of scapegoats in some instances for all of the ills of the entire, society. Boss Tweed, for instance, is a great example of someone who gets kind of heaped on, all sorts of scorn is kind of heaped upon him. And also actually, so William Boss Tweed of the Tammany Democratic Machine, but then also Roscoe Conkling, again, another one of these figures who ends up, pretty scorned by a lot of people, a lot of contemporaries, and then a lot of people who follow, who are looking back. Various waves of kind of historiography do not paint, these figures in very positive light. And I was just trying to kind of look at this from a different vantage.
Well, I think you fabulous job of that, and I want to dig into all of those case studies as we proceed. One of the terms you used a lot here is creativity, and I really think that's important because this world, this Gilded Age world, is so dynamic. There are so many things that are changing so fast, whether that is finance and capitalism and industrialization and technology and demography and city building and political alliances. And that leaves so much space for creativity by these entrepreneurial figures that you introduce us to. And I think that's one of the strengths of the book, is that while your disciplinary home is political science, you are incredibly historically oriented. It's not abstract or theoretical, right? You're grounding this intervention into how political science looks at this period in a really robust assessment of what's going on, and a sort of holistic assessment of what's going on at this moment in this place. And so electoral capitalism, I think, as a framework, transcends discipline and accounts for context. And you point out early on in your book that, these are your words, a fuller view of political behavior requires exploring the meaning of people's strategies and calculations as they are enmeshed within layers of social context. And it seems to me that a few features of this moment that you've just been describing are the context that feed the rise of electoral capitalism. And one of them, you suggest, is the democratization. And of course, that gets like 15 asterisks next to it, but the relative democratization of access to politics, especially when it comes to class and property. And I think that's really important. So tell me about how who now might have access to politics affects the rise of this new style of politics.
Yeah, that's a good starting point, I think, because one of the pieces here that I'm really quite interested just in general, even beyond the book, is in the 19th century, there is a small d democratization of office holding that is really quite central to understanding the rise of mass politics, the placement of the party as a patron that kind of supplants the gentleman politics that is in place from, say, the revolutionary period until the 1830s. And it's, I suspect, one of these pieces of the American experiment in the 19th century, which makes small d democracy popular, right, in many senses of the term, right? The idea that office holding becomes accessible to a wider array of people than had traditionally been the case. I mean, we're still talking about white men in the 19th century, right? Especially in the antebellum period, of course. But that's something that is a bit distinctive, right? Especially from moving from the gentleman period, where it's basically people who are already property, who are office holders, right? And they're kind of doing their public service as really ratification of their status. But when you have the expansion of the right to vote that's very uneven from place to place over time in the 1830s and 1840s and 1850s, the expansion of the right to vote to white men regardless of property, it creates this mass party system that is very much about the capture of public office as a way to compete, right? And the way in which that's the case is through the spoils system. So the spoils system is just immensely important to understanding the practice of politics throughout the 19th century. And there's this really quite evocative phrase from, I think it was Walt Whitman, who in his essay, Democratic Vistas, he says something like, popularity has this measureless wealth of latent power to it, right? And that's, I think, quite interesting to think about, because on the one hand, right, the way in which you win offices is by trying to appeal to a wider coalition of people than had been previously the case when suffrage was restricted to people based on, white men based on property and taxpayer qualifications, right? But when that opens up, somewhat to propertyless white men, all of a sudden you have to mobilize these larger groups of people through all sorts of, mobilization of passions and various, identities and all sorts of ways that ambitious entrepreneurs try to weave together these coalitions. But the piece of the Whitman quote that I think is fascinating is because there is also a literal wealth involved here. And that is, when you capture the offices, then you can redistribute them to your allies. And we're talking about positions in custom houses, in parks departments, in the Treasury Department, state, federal, and local government. And these are jobs that are worth having and getting for the people who are clamoring for them. There is this immense thrusting crowd of political aspirants. I think there's a Tocqueville quote there where he says something to that effect already in the 1830s. And so the kind of mass party system is made possible in part through this kind of capture and redistribution of the offices, especially in the way that the parties then require the people who are appointed to kick back a portion of their salaries to go into the party coffers so that they can pay for the next election canvass, right? And so this is some of the backdrop, I think, some of the context, especially to the party system as we kind of move into the beginning of the book, where this is the mass party system that's in place already, right? But the thing that's really quite different and something of a departure, and in political science and in the field of American political development, we like to think of how there might be change over time, right? There's a tremendous amount of change over time that takes place within the spoils system. It's not just this kind of thing that's continuous from Andrew Jackson's concept of rotation in office all the way to the Pendleton Act with the first kind of beginnings of civil service reform. There's stuff that changes within even the spoils system. And one of the things that happens is that gilded spoils, I would argue, and I try and make the case in the book, gilded spoils are analytically distinct in some ways, because the party entrepreneurs, in the context of this explosive growth that takes place in New York after the Civil War, it's boom times for a lot of this period, then there's a bust. But the political entrepreneurs begin to see how they can use the spoils system to put together these business ventures that are attached and adjunct to the party system. And they can make a lot of money and pour some of that back into mobilization as a way to try and increase their power. So there's this line from an early 20th century social scientist, a guy named Ostrogorsky, who pointed out that in the 19th century, especially after the Civil War, the spoils system kind of breaks through its shell into more commerce. And in some ways, we've long known that in the way that we've talked about railroads, for instance, right? Some of the great work by historians on railroads and the way in which political figures are trying to work angles through these companies to make some money. Richard White's book Railroaded, for instance, is a great example of that. But there are really, it's like a flowering of these experiments that takes place in the spoil system, in banks, lottery companies, liquor distillery company, tobacco, just all sorts of ventures that are tied to really, forms of mass transportation that the state and the city are trying to develop in order to meet the needs of the growing metropolis, for instance. And just in all of these different ways, there's a link between this small d democratization of politics that takes place with the kind of rise of mass politics, and then the way in which that kind of fuses with capitalism in the period and the way in which capitalism is changing, and creates something of a governing relation that is also a class relation, right? When Boss Tweed, for a brief moment, is the third largest landowner in New York, right, for a very brief amount of time. But that's a significant governing relation that's also a class relation, right, that becomes entangled. So I'm sorry if I went on too long on that question, but
not at all. I think it's great. And actually, I like how you articulate the fact that these things are fluid. The spoils system is fluid. It's not, this isn't Andrew Jackson with an axe to grind against just getting revenge on his enemies. This is a system that has really changed to meet the moment and to meet the new kinds of people who are involved in politics. And you point out, as you've suggested, that it really led to this sort of commodification of office holding, and that commodification of patronage also not only raised the material stakes of elections for those who were seeking office and their supporters who are seeking patronage positions, but it also made people more excited about politics, right? We often remark about this period when, we look back at some of these elections and we're like, why were people so passionate about this? And you're giving us an answer about the sort of rabid partisanship here too. So within this, again, limited democracy, it's a vibrant democracy, and you're suggesting that's because of, at least in part, this commodification. Is that right?
Yeah. The way to think about it, or the way that I think about it, is that the piece that is really explored here is the party organization piece, right? There are all sorts of really important issues that consume the political system and divide the parties, right? On, say, sectionalism is extremely important in this period. Sectionalism as expressed through, say, the things that really get people's blood boiling in this period, like Reconstruction and civil rights, or the tariff, right? Which is something that I always had trouble when I started teaching about 10 years ago. I could never get through to the students how important the tariff was. And then now in recent years, it's kind of reemerged as something that is a kind of political passion that kind of is a polarizing issue, right? There are all of these polarizing issues. How are you going to house and transport the people in a city as large as New York, right? All sorts of ways in which these issues divide people. But the thing that the book tries to get at is that the way in which the mass parties are being organized, right? The kind of party organization element is really important to understand how the wheels were turning, right? And in that of the parties, and in that sense, the parties are very similar, actually. It's something that is a common feature, and I would argue the organizing feature of the party system in this period. Even though there are different constituencies to the parties, different candidates, they have different stances on the issues. But the thing that in the 1870s and the 1880s, nearly the entire eligible electorate of the city of New York City and the state are turning out, and this is the context for that, right?
Yeah, no, it was fascinating to see just how passionate and engaged people were. And in just a second, I want to move on to some of your case studies that really present this vibrant world in all of its glory. But there's one more question about context I'd like to ask.
Sure.
This being a program about New York history. And of course, this is specifically a story of New York State politics, but it's one that if I allowed myself to forget it was about New York State, I would say it really is telling us about the nation and American politics in this time. And I think I assume that's intentional. So tell me what it is. Tell our viewers what it is about New York in the Gilded Age, in this moment, city and state, that makes it just the place where all of this is happening in its fullest and most vibrant and most dynamic form, because it really does seem to be the coming together of everything you're talking about contextually.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the best way to kind of get at that is there are a lot of different layers to this. One is that electoral competition is very heated in this period. And although there are periods of governing hegemony, more or less, of, say, Democrats at the local level or Republicans at the statewide level, the parties really are highly mobilized. They are competing against each other, and so because of that, they're looking for angles. And this is part of the incentive to experiment with ways to build and construct large enough coalitions in order to win. There are just tremendous spoils that are available at the city level in New York City, and then at the statewide level, and then nationally. And so because there's so much competition in the state, and because Democrats tend to be able to win in this period in New York City if they're united, and Republicans tend to have an advantage at the statewide level if they're united in this period. There's all sorts of incentives to try and figure out how to link up these different kind of partisan bastions of Republicans at the statewide level, Democrats at the local level, but then if they split, then there can be fusion or independent kind of candidates that are able to put together, say, Republicans and Democratic reformers at the city level, and maybe capture local office and distribute the spoils, as Chester Arthur was pretty instrumental in doing in the late 1870s. And so this is in the context that the state of New York is really very competitive in national elections too, right? It's one of the kind of doubtful states. It's one of these states that Republicans can win in this period, but they really have to have all of the pieces align. So Ulysses S. Grant, the great savior of the Union, does not win New York in 1868. He loses it, and it becomes this kind of spur for Republicans to figure out how they can build an organization, which ends up being done through the Custom House, but then through these other businesses that Republicans kind of work through. Morton, Bliss and Company and the U.S. Express Company that I explore in the book. They're trying to figure out how to win these electoral votes, which is one of the largest sets of electoral votes in the country at the time. So it's highly competitive, right, in national, state, and local elections. And then there's the piece that's important here, where there is a migration of kind of merchant capital into the financial sector in the 1850s, which is really boosted with the Civil War period, with the advent of the Yankee Leviathan, which ends up, Richard Bensell's kind of concept of the Yankee Leviathan, which is about the way in which the state, in order to win the Civil War, ends up centralizing a lot of capital markets into Wall Street in order to kind of try and finance the victory, the Union victory. And so that ends up transforming New York City and state politics in some important ways. And so you have both of the national parties really, in large part, financed out of New York, financed out of whatever kind of coalitions can be built from, you know, Democratic-leaning financiers and Republican-leaning financiers in the kind of financial sector, but also the single largest source of patronage in this period is at the New York Custom House. 1,500 jobs, which have very large salaries, as I try and show in the book, and those assessments, the party assessments that are taken from the control of the Custom House, end up financing the parties, right? The Republican Party coalition, especially. So then there's that piece, right? There's the kind of electoral competition piece. There's the changes in the economy piece. And then there is this historical piece, which I think is important for New York specifically, where already by the 1860s, New York State has a legacy of mobilizing and deploying public resources in order to build these kind of monumental things like canals, like railroads. There's a really important public role that the state plays in spurring the banking sector, right, in the period before the Civil War. Brian Murphy's book about the Empire State is really excellent in this way. So I think all of that combined creates this this context for ambitious political entrepreneurs to kind of put together these patronage armies on the one hand and these party-backed ventures on the other.
That's great. No, I really appreciate the way you articulate that, because it's a contemporary, it's hard to put together a contemporary understanding, but if the most populous state with the largest treasure trove in the Electoral College and the biggest coalition, the biggest group in the House of Representatives, also was the one that had the most financial firepower, and it was a swing state. And you've got also all these people who are clamoring for jobs for various reasons of the economy, and we'll talk later about, you know, the people who actually got these jobs. I mean, it's amazing how central New York was to national politics, and then the story itself on the local level, because I appreciate also how you never let the local and state level stories get overwhelmed by their national significance. You sort of balance that very nicely, which is also appreciated. And actually that's a good pivot to your case studies, because you have several, and a lot of them are, you've mentioned a few of the names already. I think anybody who's watching a show about New York history already has heard of Boss Tweed or Roscoe Conkling. And yet you give us, I think, some fascinating new stories about them. You've written a lot about Tweed here and in articles. And aside from their financial sector, which we can get into, more broadly, how would you try to expand or defy our traditional notions about Tweed and Tammany in general?
Yeah, that's a great question. Historically, I think Tweed has been a bit vilified as the guy who stole a bunch of money and bankrupted New York. And I am not gonna tell you that's not the case, you know. But I think that there's a better way to understand the Tweed and his moment, where Tweed is a figure that's, I think, his closest comparison might be someone like Cornelius Vanderbilt. Tweed sees himself, right? If we're trying to take seriously how historical actors see themselves as a way to understand what's going on, right? That can't tell you everything, but it can tell you something. Tweed sees himself as a businessman. And you could, and one of the things that I was surprised and found so fascinating about Tweed as a figure is the thing that he's doing most is, founding businesses or spreading out his investment. He has an empire, an absolute empire that's never mentioned in, a century of historiography. It's really quite striking. Almost no one had ever gone to look at the actual business side of Tweed's politics. So that can tell you a lot. For instance, one of the things, if we're talking about political practices, right, as the electoral capitalism is a practice of, accumulation, right? So Tweed wouldn't enter into a kind of political alliance with someone until he had first entered into a business alliance with them. And a great example of this is there's a moment when the population of Manhattan is booming and there's a need for mass transportation. And so the Tweed Ring is going to create this mass transit system called the Viaduct Railroad, which is going to make the central figures of Tammany Hall extremely wealthy in the chartering and the capitalization and the central role that this railroad is going to have in moving people. And the path of the Viaduct Railroad is going to go in the places, like there's going to be a stop in different neighborhoods, and that has to be brokered between the major figures in those neighborhoods and Tammany Hall through a political process. So A.T. Stewart, who's one of the founders of the department store, right? I mean, he's a celebrated figure in this period. He's extremely important. He's one of the wealthiest people in the city. He negotiates with Tweed a stop for the Viaduct Railway near his department store. But before he does that, he goes into business with Tweed and transfers this hotel, this luxury hotel called the Metropolitan Hotel, over to Tweed. So Tweed is going to take it over, and he gives it to his son to manage. And that business deal is part and parcel of the kind of trust that's built between these figures who don't really know each other from a hole in the wall, except that they're going to make each other really wealthy. It's going to be good for everyone, right? Tweed's going to handle the political side of it and get it done. And there needs to be some kind of way that they can be tied together over the long term. And so one of the things that you see, which is a recurrent pattern in Tweed's politics, is that as his coalition is getting bigger and bigger, right? Tammany sweeps city elections. That brings the Tweed Ring into power at the local level, but Tweed is also a state senator, and he is really instrumental in electing a governor, John Hoffman. And so the coalition is getting larger and larger, and always at every step, there's a business side to the coalition politics that you could see in the political institutions, in the votes, in the sign-offs of okaying of the Viaduct Railway and things like that.
So Tweed is not just a politico, he's also a businessman, an entrepreneur, and it turns out he is also a banker. Tammany offered financial services. The Tiger was also a teller. And so tell me about this, fascinating story of the Tammany Banks, how they pull this off, what their objectives are, et cetera. You tell it so well in the book. So just talk about Tammany banking, because this is fascinating.
So this was something that I was surprised to stumble into, where it's one of those things where there just hadn't been a lot written about Tammany in this period for a long time, and Tweed and the Tweed Ring in particular. But I had noticed that one thing that had always been mentioned about Tweed was that he sat on the boards or was president of a bunch of banks, and it was always just mentioned in passing. no one ever really looked into what his relationship was to that. It was always just kind of assumed, I think, that it was another one of these scams, right? That there was some kind of scam going on here, much like the Tweed ring was embezzling money through the city, that, maybe that was also true of the banks, right? He had kind of muscled his way in. But in fact, what you see, if you look at what happens in how Tammany Hall is governing in the late 1860s and in the early 1870s, in this brief period when Tammany has control, really hegemony for a very brief moment in local politics, and then there's a congruence at state in this state moment where Hoffman, the guy I just mentioned, becomes governor. There is a tremendous amount of money that is circulating through Tammany Hall and the political system more widely. And Tweed needed some banks in order to circulate that money. And what he did was he oversaw the chartering and the running of a series of savings banks. And that was what they could charter and control in the kind of immediate. There was actually a boom. There was a long period in the antebellum period where there weren't very many savings banks that were chartered by the state for all sorts of really interesting reasons that had to do with just the way in which the economic elite was pretty narrow, and control over who could kind of speculate with people's deposits, right, was pretty limited. But that's just blown wide open after the Civil War. And so when Tammany takes control of the process, Tweed charters a whole bunch of banks, and they're run by Tammany office holders or people who are local politicos, downtown local politicos. And so the idea is that they're going to own and control their own banks as a way to move this money around, because just tens of millions of dollars are being embezzled. It's just a tremendous amount of money. And the way in which that's done is actually, I think, pretty well described previously, like the kind of process of embezzlement and the avenues and everything like that. I don't really break new ground there, but the place where I break new ground is talking about how the money circulates through the political coalition and then more widely into the banking system and the political system. And so Tweed and his allies in the Tweed ring had 4 banks: the Bowling Green, the Guardian, the Yorkville, and the National Savings Bank. And they were moving, these savings banks were capitalized from a few different places, from taxpayer money, directly from city. They had the comptroller, Richard Conley, could just put city money in these banks, which automatically gave it some heft. And they were able to solicit a lot of contributions, or not contributions, but a lot of deposits from Catholic social institutions. So through the ties of the rising Irish social leaders at the time, the social and political leaders, men like Matthew Brennan and his brothers, Owen and Timothy Brennan, who were really central political figures in the 5 Points area and in downtown politics. Tyler Anbinder's book, 5 Points, is really wonderful in that. And then there are these other kinds of political figures who have a very similar profile to Tweed. They get their start in working class politics and downtown politics in volunteer fire crews, guys like Walter Roche. He's got a group of shoulder hitters who, are really good at controlling a polling place on election day. His bar is a polling place. He's a local ward leader. And he ends up being one of the central figures of these banks, sitting on multiple, as an officer in multiple of these banks. Hank Smith is actually he's the guy who runs the Bowling Green Savings Bank. And he's actually a Whig and a Republican. And he's one of these figures that's really interesting because he really makes his name in the period before the Irish and German and other kind of constituencies are have come into their full electoral power. And so he's a kind of native-born upstate guy who got to start in canal boats. And then he made his name in downtown politics, and he gets on the Board of Supervisors in 1857, and he's there with Tweed, and he meets Tweed, and then he becomes the guy who's appointed to the important positions by Tweed, who's the Republican that they need, the kind of Republican frontman. So the Republicans and the kind of native-born elite don't trust Tammany Hall to control the local police, because that's a fault line that goes back decades in city politics. And so what Tweed does is he has Hank Smith be appointed the head of the police commission, his kind of front man, and he's also the president of the Bowling Green Savings Bank. So there's this connection between this kind of cross-party alliance that takes place, where Smith is also in one of these really central local public offices, right? The coercive apparatus, the police. But then also he's the guy who's really heading up the central nerve system of the financial sector, of the Tammany Hall's financial sector, in making sure that money is flowing through these banks so that the political machine can have access to the capital it needs to finance its electoral mobilization, but also, and this is super important, make all of the office holders very wealthy. And he just does a terrible job at it. I mean, there's all sorts of, every single bad practice of bookkeeping you could think of, insider deals, looking the other way. Tweed just walks into the bank and takes out like $10,000 in cash, off the books and stuff like this. And perhaps even one of the most tragic is that the police in the city police, they raise this relief fund for victims of the Chicago fire. And that's a sizable amount of money, people throw in for that. It's a kind of cause celeb. And that fund is placed in the Bowling Green Savings Bank. Hank Smith speculates with that money in bad deals, in bad kind of speculative ventures, and loses it all. This is the kind of way in which the Tammany Banks were run. So it's not terribly surprising that they didn't last that long. But the piece that makes it really quite interesting for the collapse of the Tweed Ring is in the period after some of these revelations about embezzlement had finally become public and there was some evidence for it. The New York Times, publishes the books on the front page, and it's pretty clear that there's money disappearing. And what happens is that the guy who controls the city money, the comptroller, Richard Conley, is pushed out. And Andrew H. Green, one of these figures of late 19th century New York history, these seminal figures, he steps in and he knows exactly where he should withdraw city funds. And it's from the Bowling Green Savings Bank, and it's from the Guardian Savings Bank, which are these Tammany institutions. All he's got to do is withdraw something like $56,000, which is in the grand scheme of the amount of money that has been, of city money that had been placed in these banks, really not a lot. And there's just a run on the bank. Immediately they know that the jig is up. And so a lot of common laborers who were also Tammany constituents, a lot of downtown workers who had placed small sums of money in these banks like the Bowling Green and the Guardian and the Yorkville Savings Bank, to a lesser extent, the National Savings Bank. This money disappears. I mean, it's basically the kind of the smoke and mirror game is over, and there's a run on the bank, and a lot of these common depositors are left high and dry. But I think a really good indication that the banks weren't meant to be swindles. They were really trying to build these banks as legitimate institutions, the Tammany office holders. Tweed had money in there. Hank Smith, who's running these banks, he's got accounts in there. All of the downtown political class of Tammany office holders, they all have some accounts in these banks, which you could see if you go look through the bankruptcy proceedings, because people are trying to recoup their money. And so it really was something that the Tweed era Tammany Hall folks were trying to create as an institution that was going to be very closely allied with the political machine, but doesn't last.
It's fascinating because, as you point out, this isn't a question of it being maybe purposefully corrupt as much as it was just ineptly managed. And also, I think, I mean, the tragedy, as you point out, is that the same sort of working class, often immigrant or child of immigrant constituents who were backing Tweed were also the people who were investing in these banks, as well as charities, as you point out.
Right.
And so it's a sort of tragic fall in many ways because of the collateral damage. And it fits interestingly into the sort of bigger, more spectacular, I suppose, fall of Tweed narrative. I think this shows how it was much more complex, and it directly hurt more people, right?
Yeah, yeah. I came to the view that Tweed was an actual person with actual feelings, who was complicated when I read the papers that are the largest extant collection of papers about Boss Tweed are in Texas at Texas Tech in Lubbock, which is a family collection through his brother's side, Richard Tweed, that kind of travels from New York to Texas, I think in the 50s. And you could read the correspondence there, and he sounds, I mean, he's completely broken by the collapse of his influence, and he sounds like a guy who has the walls closing in on him, but he's not. He's the way that he's built up in the political mobilization against Tammany Hall that takes place in 1871 to 1874, 1875, is that he's this evil mastermind, right? Who's working alone and stealing all the money, and then, you know, spending it on himself, and the rest is probably buried somewhere. You know, all the riches of New York are that, you know, New York's bankrupt, but that's all like buried on Treasure Island or something like that. The reality is that he's in his later years. He's trying to figure out how to get his sister-in-law a few bucks for coal so she can get the family through the winter. And he's trying to figure out how to organize that from prison after all of his investments have collapsed, and he has, you know, there's no liquid, you know, cash that he can kind of like move around anymore. He can't, his assets have basically been seized and divided. And so, yeah, I think he's very much a figure who's basically a captain of industry who loses at big time. And, you know, he's a robber baron, basically, in that sense, you know, of accumulating accumulating a fortune through centralizing an industry, in this case politics, and leveraging that to open up, you know, a pretty diversified business portfolio, and then it all just comes tumbling down.
No, I think presenting him as a robber baron, that it really works very well. It's interesting how much crossover is there between rival bankers in New York versus the sort of traditional good government, New York Times, et cetera, attack on Tweed. Is there common cause or even crossover, or is these different?
Yeah, this is where the alliances and the rivalries get, I think, pretty complicated, where the main rivals for the Tammany Banks were the older and established immigrant savings banks, like the Emigrant. There was a kind of German savings bank equivalent of that. And that had created, and those were run by a group of immigrants, Irish and German immigrants who had come earlier, who had established themselves and their prestige and their networks earlier than the Tweed Ring and the kind of consolidation of Tammany Hall into these new areas. And so some of the most vociferous critics of the Tweed Ring and Tweed were the heads of these old savings banks, Charles O'Connor, Philip Bissinger, and they are one of the pieces of the collapse of the Tweed Ring, which had not previously kind of been covered, is the pursuit of those immigrant savings banks folks against trying to bring all of the Tammany Banks into bankruptcy through court proceedings. And so all like them and their lawyers are, representing these depositors are trying to get their money back, and they're trying to convince the judges to throw the hammer down. And they're engaged in a very public campaign against the Tammany Banks. And so you see them at the forefront of the kind of downtown Manhattan group of rivals, right? But then there are the kind of more prestigious mainline banks that are run oftentimes by native-born Republicans that dealt very seamlessly with Tweed, that were more than happy to take city deposits, that were very excited to have Tweed and other members of the Tweed Ring, Peter Sweeney, Richard Connolly, and others, Hugh Smith, be depositors in their bank, to have those banks loan out to make loans to the various business ventures that these people were engaged in, or their real estate purchases to offer securities and things like that. So those banks really benefited a lot from the way in which the Tweed Ring operated, because one of the pieces that I haven't mentioned here specifically, although I mentioned it in general, with the way in which office holders can tap into the political institutions in order to raise capital, but the Tweed Ring tripled city debt in like 3 or 4 years. That is incredible if you think about it, which means that there was just a huge amount of money that was then circulating through the financial system, and it went through the banks. There's no way that the Tammany Banks alone could have handled all of that, right? That's flowing through the main banking institutions that were in place at the time. None of that is picked up in any of the narratives about the collapse of Tweed, where, who's responsible for bringing New York into bankruptcy? Oh, it's Boss Tweed, right? Boss Tweed becomes this really convenient scapegoat, and some of the more long-standing respected business leaders who had very much accepted city business, knowing what was going on, right? They get off scot-free. I mean, there are very few repercussions that happen for those members of the pre-existing financial elite. And a great example of that, I think, is George Updike, who is he was a mayor of New York during the Civil War. After his kind of political career is over, he becomes one of the business establishment. He is kind of doing this financial brokerage firm. And he's also a member of the Chamber of Commerce. He's like the vice president of the Chamber of Commerce or something like that, right? I mean, Tweed has an account with him, right? With George Updike, who is probably one of the more upstanding citizens of the kind of old patrician elite that you could think of, right? He's like the symbol of what they wish the city, how the city would continue to be governed, right? Well, when Tweed goes down, Updike says, I mean, I had no idea that he had an account with my firm. And then he basically just kind of very casually says, you know, he sends an embarrassed letter to investigators, to Samuel Tilden's investigators, when they're trying to go and follow the money to see if they can claw any of it back for the city. But Updike never gives he doesn't give a commission back to the city or anything like that he got from using Tweed's money to, speculate on Wall Street or something like that. So yeah, I think it's those kinds of power dynamics are very obscured by the way in which the Tweed ring tale has been told throughout the years.
No, I think it's a great point, and I think it's a great intervention. And as we'll talk about nearer the end, you do a pretty good job, an excellent job, in fact, of not only complicating the sort of good government versus these people we're talking about narrative, but also offering maybe some alternative frameworks. But before we get to that, we've talked about the Democrats. There's some pretty potent Republican organizations in New York in these years. And of course, you mentioned Conkling and his gang, and you've already mentioned the centrality of the New York Customs House to patronage operations. You say in the book that at the port, we see the logic of party-based accumulation in its pure form. And I think there's a lot that can sort of grow out of that statement. So I'll sort of open it up to you.
Sure, yeah. So I think that particular claim is related to the way in which the Stalwarts, that's the faction that Conkling organizes in New York, that's connected to the National Party faction in the Republican Party at the time, largely in the 1870s and early 1880s. There's a way in which they are, I think, rightfully understood to have organized a very powerful statewide party. This is a faction that's basically in power for 10 years. That's a long time in politics. That's particularly a long time when you think about the ebb and flow of politics in this period. But the Conkling faction of the Republican Party captures the Custom House, the New York Custom House, and they mine it for party assessments and party labor through these 1,500 positions that they're able to appoint through, the port collectors got tremendous amount of discretion there. But then there's another piece to the way in which they can mine the Custom House, and that is through the fines that they can levy on merchants. So there's a major merchant, Phelps Dodge, that gets fined something like $270-something thousand in in the 1870s. I forget exactly what year it is. But that's a fine that's potentially millions of dollars. And it's really quite dubious, the way in which Chester Arthur, who's the port collector at the time, is basically trying to raise money for the party because Roscoe Conkling is going to run for president. And who's got to pay? One of the unlucky merchants, basically, one of the unlucky merchant houses that can afford it. And so what ends up happening is, this is part of the way in which the moiety system was set up, where the U.S. government gets a piece, and then these office holders get a piece. But Roscoe Conkling also got a piece because he was the quote unquote lawyer for the officials, but basically because he's the boss, right? And so that's an example of the way in which the Conkling machine in New York very much did understand the party as a company, a kind of joint stock company that was organized in a way that the people at the top got the largest chunk, and then the lieutenants, got the second largest chunk, and then the people at the bottom got, what was ever left, and it was distributed in a way that was hierarchical, organized by influence within the party and however important they were, and what they deserved. And so it's kind of like profit sharing, basically. But the piece there that I think is quite interesting is that we know already about, I mean, previous historians have talked about that episode, I think, with justification at some length. So both Roscoe Conkling and Chester Arthur have really wonderful biographies about them. David Jordan and Thomas Reeves have written really wonderful biographies that are very richly detailed about this episode. But the piece that I try and show is that's actually the beginning. That's the start of the machine, not the end. That's the beginning of the spoils system as we kind of understood it historically. But the Conkling machine breaks out of that shell. And so the way in which they do that is by being involved in all sorts of really important real estate speculation that's taking place in New York City at the time. Chester Arthur goes in with all sorts of other Republican office holders into these speculative ventures. Together, they're speculating in these pieces of land, right? They're investing in mines together out west. They're co-managing institutions like the U.S. Express Company. They're creating and enlarging these really central institutions like Levi Morton's financial brokerage firm, Morton, Bliss and Company, which becomes this bank for the Republican elite in the Gilded Age, in a really fascinating way. And so the point that I was trying to make with opening the vignette of this chapter on the stalwart political machine, their organization, with the Custom House, the capture of the Custom House in, I think it's like 1870, with Thomas Murphy, who's the Conkling's guy who becomes the Port Collective first before Chester Arthur. That's the beginning of then moving out into these other ventures that are ways that the Republican coalition is able to access new forms of capital and then invest it in ways that are going to reverberate to their benefit.
Well, I think that's such a great intervention too, because I think, as you say, we know much of the Customs House story, the port story, and you point out that's only the beginning. There are all these they're like patronage adjacent operations, and they're just as much a part of the party. There's a point later on where you're talking about Morton Bliss, and you say it basically was the party. I'd love to hear more. I mean, we think after Conkling, you end up eventually with Boss Platt, and you tie his rise to U.S. Express, and of course there's Levi Morton. But talk about those two firms which you've already invoked, but especially Morton Bliss. I think it's fascinating how, Levi Morton's a survivor. You've got all of these wars going on within this sort of crumbling faction, and we know all the stories about Arthur and Conkling falling out, and Alonzo Cornell's collateral, and of course Jay Gould's involved, and all these different. But the one guy who just seems to get through it all is Levi Morton, and it seems as though that has to do with his business ties and their political value. So talk about it, basically.
Yeah, the Morton piece to this is really quite useful in thinking through the tensions between individual ambition on the one hand, right, which is, if you go and read, political science theory about why parties form, one of the main lines of thinking there is that parties are useful for individuals to realize their ambitions, right, for higher office or more power and things like that. So that's one of the reasons why parties come together in the various forms they do at different moments. But there's a lot of tension there with, on the one hand, the ambition of the individual, and then on the other hand, the potential health of the entity like the party organization, for instance. So Levi Morton is the quintessential party regular, the stalwart party regular. He is Conkling's guy through and through, in part because Levi Morton ends up founding one of the most important financial brokerage firms of the Gilded Age. And the way in which these financial brokerage houses in this period are like a dime a dozen, basically. I mean, people are trying to get in and get an angle however they can. And I mean, Morton's clever, he's a hard worker, but so is everyone, right? But the thing that elevates his firm is that he gets in with Conkling and the Stalwarts and uses patronage through the Grant administration. When Ulysses S. Grant is president, the Stalwarts are at the height of their power, the height of their influence, because of the way in which Conkling helps Grant win New York in 1872 when he's running for re-election against the liberal Republican bolters. That's a bit of a digression there. But the Stalwarts are really important to Grant in that way, and he rewards them, and Conkling he delivers a tremendous amount of patronage to a tremendously lucrative patronage to Levi Morton and Morton Bliss and Company, which is the firm, giving them the first the ability to be in part of this kind of group of financial brokerage firms to sell U.S. government debt abroad, because there's a tremendous, again, growth in public debt because it's so expensive to fight and win in the Civil War for the Union. And so they're trying to sell this debt in European markets and in London, and whoever gets that gets the ability to take a commission on those sales. So the bigger piece of that you get of selling U.S. government debt abroad, the more money you get, and the healthier your firm is going to be. And even beyond that, what ends up happening is that all of the other kind of really significant players in the Gilded Age financial scene see that Levi Morton's company is the preferred brokerage firm of the Grant administration. And so they're going to do business with them because they're elevated. And so Morton's career is really made through the patronage that Grant and the Treasury Department under Grant give Morton Bliss and Company. And they're really instrumental in financing the expansion of railroads in this period, in financing the debt of southern states during Reconstruction. They become actually pretty central to that story too, because they don't want southern states to be able to repudiate their debt because they're involved in that. And so they really become a particularly important financial brokerage house, but it's one that is being run in alliance with Conkling's Stalwarts. It's financing the Stalwart machine in New York. It's financing Conkling's national ambitions. He wants to be Secretary of State if he can't be president. Like, you know, there are national goals, and what ends up happening is that the Stalwart faction falls apart for all sorts of reasons that factions tend to do. Personal rivalries, national conditions change. The Western and Midwestern wing of the Republican Party, the National Republican Party, don't want to have Conkling have so much influence, right? They're trying to cut him out in the Hayes administration and the Garfield administration. And what ends up happening is that the Stalwart faction unravels in the early 1880s. But by that time, Morton Bliss and Company is already established. It is already well on its way to, you know, being at the center of the Gilded Age political economy, the transatlantic, the Anglo-American Gilded Age financial circulation. And so Morton is still important after Conkling is not anymore. After Conkling's out of the Senate, you know, he's diminished. And his factional rivals, the half-breeds and James Blaine, have basically won their factional dispute. Blaine wants to crush Conkling, and he does, but he wants to bring in Morton because Morton is the one who can finance a national campaign. So the letters are really fascinating between Blaine and Blaine's allies and Morton, where they're trying to cultivate Morton. They're trying to see if they can bring Morton on to work with the half-breeds at this moment where Conkling still has some influence, so it's risky for Morton. And basically what ends up happening is his political career takes off, Morton's career takes off, Conkling's goes down into the drain. And if you look through the correspondence of Morton, Bliss and Company, it's all sorts of back and forth between all these different factions of the Republican Party who are trying to basically get theirs, right? Like members of Congress who want stock tips, right? They're willing to trade information about the progress of silver bills through the House of Representatives in return for, help with what the next big investment is in a railroad or something like that. And so the centrality of Morton, Bliss and Company is really is right at the core of what the Stalwarts were at the height of their power. But it's an institution that endures after the Stalwarts collapse, whereas the Tammany Banks, they disappear. I mean, they're gone and no one hears about them after that, basically. Morton has a very long political career, vice president, right, governor. He's got these very nice positions as ambassador. I think he's ambassador to France, like that's a prestigious post, right? And then at the end of his career, he sells to J.P. Morgan, and that his brokerage firm is kind of merged into the Morgan empire. It's just a completely different trajectory than the Tammany Banks in that way.
It's such a fascinating story, and part of it is, he's not seen early on as sort of political heavyweight. A lot of people are dismissive of him, but he's so good at navigating all of this, and he seems to understand how it works, and he also seems to understand how to play these factions to his advantage,
Right.
Whereas a lot of them are at war not only with each other but with themselves. You pointed out that electoral capitalism, yes, these people are enriching themselves, but it's not supposed to be only about yourself. You're supposed to be doing it as part of a team. And so when they all start sort of squabbling, he seems to be the one who gets out of that alive. It's a fascinating story.
Yeah.
The way you tell it is so rich, and so I appreciate it.
Oh, thanks.
Now, what's also interesting is that regular people had a lot at stake. We saw, Tammany constituents had a lot to lose when Tammany Banks failed. You talked at the very beginning that this is part of why there was more sort of popular engagement and people showing up to vote in these years. And you look in chapter 3 at how all of this how it affected regular partisans. You discuss the lived experiences of petty office holders. And it's fascinating because I think, again, what I appreciate is you take a very nuanced view of it. You call them, on the one hand, the employer of last resort for the needy among the electoral crowd. You credit them with redistributing some of the wealth that the partisans had accumulated, but I think some is the important word there, as a de facto form of welfare. But on the other hand, as we'll see in a moment, you're not here to praise these guys as great redistributive engines. But what did, before we get to the critiques, what did the rank and file get out of all of this? And what should we understand about the benefit for the voters? They're not just saps, in other words.
No, definitely not. And again, this is, I think, one of the great tragedies to come out of some of the earlier interpretations of who is engaged in politics in this period. The caricatures drawn by Thomas Nast and others of this period and the elite reformers is that these people who are involved in office holding, petty office holding. That is to say, the people who are at the bottom of these offices, not the Conklings, not the Platts, not the people who are presidents or secretaries of state and things like that, but the people who are, messengers, street sweepers, the people who are working at the docks, who are the weighers, the menial tasks, the people who are working in the post office. The view of them is just that they're kind of unthinking pawns, basically, and it's really wrong, I think, to think of them in that way. They were referred to in their kind of in one of the most offensive ways that you could think of at the time as not statesmen, but placemen, right? People who are only there for a place, and it's really low of them to only just want a job, right? But basically, what people are getting out of this moment when the patronage armies are really expanding quite rapidly, and there's a public side to patronage armies, and then there's a kind of private side to patronage armies, because the U.S. Express Company and Western Union, I mean, they're stacked in their boards with all sorts of patronage appointees, right? And in their lower corporate offices as well. But in the public side of this, right, what we conventionally think of as kind of the Jacksonian spoil system, where your party wins and then you get a job in the Parks Department or something like that, right? Those folks read the partisan newspapers very, very closely. Those newspapers are not terribly interesting or entertaining. They are filled with these minute details about factional strife of the kind between, say, Tammany and Swallowtail Democrats, or say, Stalwarts and Half-Breed Republicans, right? And who would be interested in that kind of just minute, boring details? Well, the people who wanted the jobs that might come from whoever was going to be in a position to make appointments. And so what people wanted in this moment where jobs were extremely precarious, this is a moment of intense industrialization where, the United States goes from a society of patchwork markets to a market society. Wage labor is much more permanent now than it had been in the past, which means that employment is seasonal. If you get hurt on the job, you're out. You may never be able to make a living wage again, that kind of thing. And so the expansion of the bottom of the spoils system to these patronage armies was very much linked up with the aspirations that those people had for what they would refer to in their own language as a situation, right? A situation was a job that was going to get you by, or maybe even put you in a position to move up and get a little bit better off, right? So maybe you would be able to get a gig for a season at the custom house as a way to try and work your political networks to later get a higher level, say, clerkship at the custom house. Maybe if you're, a weigher, to move to a clerk, and then maybe from the custom house, maybe move to the Treasury Department or something like that, right? And so that's very, very modest, right? The aspirations of people are basically just to find employment so that they can survive and get by. And again, in the language of the day, establish a competency. And a competency is basically just have a stable household that you can be so you can be somewhat independent, right? You can establish social ties, get some maybe neighborhood prestige, be a leading figure in your local political club, but maybe your whatever your religious organization you're involved in, your neighborhood groups, right? That would establish you into a competency if you could get a gig that would pay well enough. And some of these, I mean, it depends on which kind of situation you're talking about as to how much that actually brought people into a competency. But it was pretty precarious as well, because you get into a sweet patronage gig, your patron loses some influence, you're out, right? And also there are a bunch of people scrounging behind you to try and push you out so that they can get your salary. So it was really quite precarious, but there was such an immense crowd of partisans who were always competing for these positions that it made them very competitive, and it made the internal party operations really something like an alternative labor market, where there's always these negotiations going on about who, who's going to get the job that's coming out of this constituency, who's going to be the representative of this local committee that's going to get the job at the custom house or something like that, right? And then how long are they going to have it? Are they going to be able to move up? Are they going to be kicked out? That kind of thing. So that meant a lot to people. And so one of the things that I do in the book is I found this incredibly rich archive of patronage correspondence that was in a guy named James Butler's collection at the New York Public Library. And James Butler was the appointments the appointments director for the Treasury Secretary, a guy named Charles Folger, in the Arthur administration of Chester Arthur, right? Arthur's the stalwart Republican president. He puts in Charles Folger, who's this kind of quintessential stalwart Republican from New York, and who is trying to run for governor at the same time as he's Treasury Secretary. So he's directed James Butler to be coordinating patronage to the benefit of his campaign. Butler is also his campaign manager. So it's an incredibly rich set of patronage correspondence where you could see the way in which these flows of applicants are moving their petitions to Butler and making all sorts of pleas for largely relief of various kinds, poor relief, basically. Someone is a union veteran and then they're disabled, so they need light work, right? Light work is something that's not going to be too demanding, and it's probably something that maybe you're even paid a salary and you don't show up, right? Or something like that. Or whatever. A brother's an alcoholic and he's trying to get back on his feet. Can you give him this position? He'll I can vouch for him, he'll turn his life around. Like that kind of thing. There's a tremendous I was really surprised by the volume of patronage letters that were widowed, that were widows, that were asking for clerkships so that they could kind of keep the family going after the kind of male breadwinner figure was no longer in the picture. And this is clearly a kind of poor relief. In some cases, it was mediated directly through the relief agencies at the local level that were operating in, say, New York or elsewhere. So this is not at all the picture of the kind of spoilsman who's out to rapaciously gobble up everything that they can. That's, I think, probably much more accurate up at the top, right? That is how Conkling operated, right? That is how people who are at the top in Tammany Hall operated. But the people at the bottom are basically just trying to survive. They're basically they're survivors.
No, I think it's an excellent point, and I think that in recovering those voices, especially through the collection you note, you really do a great deal to help give us a more humane interpretation of this world and the people who are engaged in it. I think you're right that even though there have been a couple of attempts over several generations of scholars to reform the academic understanding of the machine and the boss. I mean, I think of my very close friends who recently passed away, John Bunker, and the sort of urban liberal school. And I wish he could have seen your book because I think he would have loved it. There have been attempts, and yet it's never really taken, right? There's been this sort of, people still seem to gravitate toward, well, it's this sort of corrupt organization all the way to the bottom. And I think unintentionally, it sort of makes the cruel elitist views of the voters sort of unfortunately linger. And so maybe it's not Thomas Nast's racist caricatures or Godkin trying to get all of these people disenfranchised, but it's an attitude that sort of takes at face value what the elite reformers are saying, and you do a lot to counteract that. But the other thing I think that's nice about what you present as an alternative is you're not saying, okay, therefore these people should be at the top should be lionized, and electoral capitalism was this wonderful thing. You point out that, as you suggested, it's by definition capricious, and you suggest even that it greatly exacerbated the Gilded Age's crisis of inequality. And so how did this maybe it's helping people tread water, but ultimately you suggest it makes things worse? Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way to think about it is, again, I try and make a point to not wade into the corruption category, because ultimately at the end of the day, what is referred to as corruption just changes all the time. There's a legal definition that changes all the time, and everyone thinks that politics is corrupt, but what they really mean is that they think that something is going on that's improper, right? And so, and again, I also have many things that I think that are going on generally in politics that are probably improper, but I don't think it helps to impose that as a category. That's not very clarifying ultimately. What I try to do is suggest that this social protection, this form of partisan poor relief for the politically connected poor, which is not everyone. It's one of these many different kinds of proto-welfare states that were created before the New Deal to service particular populations, right? My argument is that what I think happened is that social protection expands in this period because of demands from below. And this is what party leaders could do in response that would increase their power. So it's always not, it's not Charles Folger, who's the Treasury Secretary, who's running for governor of New York, loses, but who's running for governor of New York, and he's trying to leverage this patronage. It's not like, I mean, he's a generally charitable fellow, but really what he's trying to do is capture office and gain power. And that's the angle of, and that's if you could think of, I don't know if you're familiar with, there's a political scientist, James Scott, who wrote a book called Seeing Like the State. And it's like the way in which, the state sees the population as, say, statistics or whatever, right? The census, right? That's an example. But if you're seeing like a spoilsman, you see these people who are clamoring for situations and competencies. You're expanding social protection as a way to build up your political organization. And what that ends up doing is it's a process essentially of centralization. I think Morton Keller has this really great chapter called The Triumph of Organizational Politics. And it's important to see this creation of patronage armies from the demands of people below, right, that they're responding to. They're responding to it in a way that's centralizing power within the parties into the hands of these party leaders who are somewhat, I would say they get an autonomy from the kind of demands of the public writ large because they have the capacity to move these machines in certain directions. And they also get an autonomy from, say, what a robber baron wants them to do, or maybe, merchants want the custom house to act in a certain kind of way that's more on the merit system or whatever, they can ignore that because these party leaders have centralized capital from assessments from the patronage armies and also these other business ventures that they've got that are diversified across all these different areas. So the party leaders can kind of do what they want, and they can take they're historical actors in their own right. I mean, there's some really wonderful studies like Sven Beckert's Moneyed Metropolis, which is a really exquisite book. But when it thinks about how politicians are operating, they're basically doing whatever the rich want them to do. But that's not quite right. In fact, if you become a party leader in this period, you have a lot of your own leverage because you have these different pools of capital that you've put together because of your patronage armies. You are independent in some ways. And that is something that, got a lot of pushback from, say, the business class that wanted politicians to be, in their own sphere. There's a mentality that, when party leaders are pushing into these party ventures that are going into the economy, that are, going into banking, for instance, right? That this is capital thus wrongly acquired, right? It's wrong for that. They're kind of stepping over their bounds, right? But the point of thinking about how the expansion of social protection at the bottom fits in is that it basically makes the party leaders more powerful and more able to go and do these experiments to try and create and accumulate more wealth for themselves and their allies in ways that makes many, many people very, very angry. Lots of controversies around these strategies.
Yeah, no, I think it's so well done. I was just in passing. I'm glad that you brought up Morton Keller. There were several times while I was reading this that I thought how wonderfully several episodes in your book sort of functioned as nice, rich, in-depth studies of sort of the broad world he's trying to describe in affairs of state back in the day. I liked it, especially my advisor as a PhD student, Dr. David Cecilia. His advisor was Morton Keller. So
oh, cool.
Any Morton
Nice.
Keller reference. I once met him in a restaurant in Cambridge. It's a long story, but I got to have dinner a few times toward the end of his life with Oscar Handland and his wife Lillian Handland, and Dr. Lillian Handland looks over at me. She's like, "Have you heard of the historian Morton Keller?" And I was like, "Oh, of course. He was my advisor's advisor." And she stands up and shouts across this Chinese restaurant on Massachusetts Avenue, "Mickey, I want you to meet one of your grandchildren." And he comes over. We have this. So
that's great.
That was, but more to the point, I think that this is a sort of, it's a nice, rich series of examples of some of the big trends he tries describing that in other places. I'll say, as you're talking about sort of the differences in how those at the bottom of this electoral capitalism system, or those on the outskirts of it trying to get in, how they were looking at it versus those at the top, you have rather a fierce critique of electoral capitalism, right? Again, you're not here to sort of celebrate it, but your critique is very different from some of the more traditional assessments. You instead offer historical alternatives that, in your words, sought to fundamentally restructure the link between public office and capitalism, not by disenfranchising poor people and immigrants, but instead by, in your words, decommodifying politics and pursuing reform from below. You have a couple of examples, and I'll invite you to get into those a bit if you'd like.
Yeah, thanks. I should say I might be a little bit more brief on this part, just because I know that my wife, I've got to switch childcare with my wife soon.
Absolutely. I don't want to take too much time.
No, I've so enjoyed this conversation, and so thank you for it. Yeah, I think of, so I tried to look at electoral capitalism, the party system in this period from the top down, right, the party leaders, and then the bottom up with the petty office holders. And then I try and look at from the outside in, the people who really were critics of how this worked and saw party leaders making deals with each other for mutual enrichment. And in fact, that's the case in some respects. There are Republicans who treat with Tweed, Tammany Republicans, and that's a kind of common theme. Henry George, who's the guy who runs an independent candidacy in 1886 to be mayor of New York, he has this line where he says something like, these guys are just, I'm paraphrasing, but these guys, they yell like hell against each other, in public, and then, in private, they go and they make their backroom deals. They engage in these combinations, like this kind of anti-monopolist perspective on combinations, but not between companies, or business actors, but between parties, like Republican, Tammany Hall and Stalwart Republicans, and then they go and have a beer with each other after it's all over, right? They go and they're ostensibly in competition with each other, and they are, but there's something that's happening there that's keeping this system in place that people on the outside were pretty critical of, because this is a period when the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. So there are a lot of critics, and so there's this moment in the 1880s when there's a social movement upsurge, largely associated with the labor movement, but also with transatlantic Irish radicalism. That's an important piece here, and that there's a piece here of political reform. There are people who want to reform the political system, and there are a number of proposals to try and attack this party system that come from the Greenback Labor Party, the Henry George campaign, these, kind of quixotic debate clubs. There's one called Spread the Light Club that has all sorts of ideas about what should be done. And there are these really interesting campaigns by labor unions like the Typographers Union number 6, Big Six, which is, it's printers who are employed by the New York Tribune, which is one of the singular papers of the age. It's an important paper. It kind of had the place in national news back then that the New York Times has, today to some degree. It's very much locally rooted, but it had national influence in that kind of same way. And they try and leverage the party subsidies from the Republican Party that are going to the newspaper in order to win a union shop against their employer who's trying to bust their union. And so they're trying to leverage voters in an election campaign when James Blaine is running for president in 1884. They're trying to pressure Blaine and the state Republican Party to get Whitelaw Reid, who was the owner of the New York Tribune, to basically recognize the union shop. And that's not so much a fundamental kind of restructuring of the party system so much in that case as trying to expand who's benefiting from the patronage, right? There are a lot of patronage subsidies that are flowing from the Blaine campaign, from the Republican Party, state and local committees in New York and elsewhere across the North that are subscribed to this paper. It's a party paper. The paper is a party regular. And the printers were saying, you say the tariff is being raised to benefit all workers, but what about the way in which the benefits should be shared within the New York Tribune? And they tried to make it a kind of cause célèbre. So there are a lot of different kinds of critiques of the party system. Some of them that want to really just dismantle the parties altogether. Like the Henry George critique is, and the critique of some of the later Georgists who follow him, like John Sullivan, who has this idea that the referendum, for instance, should be used so that voters will completely bypass office holders in the way that they were instrumental in the party machines, so that voters could vote on how to govern themselves, and there wouldn't be the need for these kind of office-holding capitalists. And that this was very much a kind of trajectory of Georgism that was a legacy of after George is gone. It's kind of lingers on, and there are these guys who try and think about different ways to reform the parties.
Well, just by way of closing, I'll ask you, because of course, ultimately, I mean, they have legacies, these other reformers, but at least for the moment, they're mostly going to remain marginal and defeated. And you point out near the end of your book that at the turn of the century, the poor were poorer, the rich were richer, and this centralization and maldistribution of political property had been part of that process as well.
Yeah.
And so maybe it's not a pleasant way of ending our conversation, but I'll ask you, what are some legacies moving into the years that follow of electoral capitalism at the time you studied it, for New York or just for our democratic republic?
Yeah, one that I'll mention that took a while to dawn on me was there's so much that is public facing to how politics operates. There's an entertainment quality to it, which was particularly pronounced in this period, that has kind of resurged in recent years, right? With all the celebrities and everything like that of contemporary politics. And there are these hot button issues that people are talking about, and there are the political figures. But actually, if you take a look behind the curtain, so to speak, in this period, there is so much politics that's going on behind the scenes that are just absolutely crucial for understanding power dynamics. So the ways in which these office holders are able to speculate on Wall Street and found their law firms and try and start up a lottery company or something like that, or all of these different angles, right, that are related to the political competition. That's stuff that we don't see. And in fact, it's quite difficult to get at how an office holder becomes so wealthy. But it's important for understanding how politics works. And so that's one thing that I think people at the time in the Gilded Age had some sense of, right? They knew that all of a sudden, Thomas Platt is a very, modest middle-class druggist in Owego. And then all of a sudden, he is one of the wealthiest people in the country, right? I mean, how does that happen? People have a sense that there's something going on. They don't really know what. And in fact, it took me 10 years to go through this material and peel back some of these layers and make these connections. And there's just no way voters at the time had a sense of what was going on here. Just one quick example, the connection between Lenox Library and Thomas Murphy, who ends up at the Custom House, who is instrumental in the boomtown of Long Branch, New Jersey, who is treating with Tammany Hall and speculating in real estate. I mean, voters just had no idea, right, that this kind of capital was circulating between people who are trying to do politics. And I think that one of the legacies here is that it's important to try and figure this out if you want to understand things that are going on, right? I don't think you can have a full understanding of politics unless you can try and figure some of this out. I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist. I don't think everyone's doing this all the time and anything like that. But pretty clearly, there's a lot that we're not seeing. It's a little bit of the iceberg situation, right? You see the tip of the iceberg, but a lot of it's below the water. So I'd say that's a bit of a takeaway in terms of a legacy. When you can get a better understanding of the business deals that are following along with the politics, that I think can be really helpful for making sense of the world. And ultimately having some kind of small d democratic ability to shape your reality, right?
Right, and that's the key that you present toward the end as well. It's not just the party noir and this sort of dark story of things getting worse and worse, but saying we need to be aware of all of this, and then that opens up other avenues. But
Yeah.
I'm so grateful, Jeff, both for this wonderful new revisionist framework of looking at Gilded Age New York politics, and I think politics generally, but also for your generosity with your time. I recommend everybody, if you haven't already, get your hands on a copy of Electoral Capitalism from University of Pennsylvania Press. Thank you so much, Jeff, for joining us on Empire State Engagements.
Rob, thank you so much for this opportunity to talk about the book, and it's so fun, so I appreciate it. And also, if I could just mention that I know that the book, the price tag is a little bit high, as academic books tend to be. So if folks want to read the book, they can, I think, if they're maybe able to access a university library, they should be able to get it through JSTOR. The entire book is there too, but in digital form. So if you have access to JSTOR, you don't have to spend $55.
Well, that's incredibly generous of you as well. And I'll say, we won't tell Pennsylvania you said that, but I think you and I both know that as if anybody's watching and they're worried about the authors, we're not going to make money off of these books we write. So you don't have to worry about us. And so generous to the very end of the conversation. Thank you, Jeff, for your kindness and your wonderful work.
Thank you.